we gotta talk. So I keep seeing this obsession online with oversimplifying everything. And I need people to understand that oversimplification is not neutral. It's not harmless. It creates intellectual laziness. And that laziness is exactly how stereotypes survive and how systems of oppression stay invisible. And that's why I see so many people fail to be able to connect the dots to the big picture, aka critically think and fully understand what's happening. Don't go. I think you should stay with me. I highly encourage you to stay with me. So let's take an example and break it down, shall we? There's a stereotype about Asian Americans that we're perpetual foreigners. The idea that Asian Americans are always from somewhere else, no matter how many generations we've been here. But that stereotype, like all stereotypes, does not come from nowhere. It's not cultural, it's not accidental. It is the direct result of specific historical decisions reinforced over time by institutions, media, and policy. History doesn't just happen and go away. It ripples. Every law creates a reaction. Every exclusion shapes perception. So Asian Americans have been in what is now the U.S. since at least the 16th century. Chinese sailors arrived in Spanish-controlled territories. Filipino sailors settled in Louisiana in the 1700s. Chinese laborers built the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1800s. Japanese, Korean, South Asian, Filipino communities were established long before most people think Asian Americans just showed up in the 60s. But that history is routinely erased. Instead, the dominant narrative starts in 1965, and that's where oversimplification does real damage. So let's rewind. The 19th and early 20th century, Asian immigrants were actively recruited for labor, gold mining, agriculture, railroads, etc., and then punished for being too successful or too different. An anti-Asian sentiment exploded into law. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 didn't just restrict immigration, it explicitly barred Chinese immigrants from naturalizing as citizens. That legally marked them as permanent outsiders, undesirable, unable to assimilate because they were non-white. Then came the Immigration Act of 1924, which effectively barred almost all Asian immigration by tying eligibility to citizenship, and Asians were legally ineligible for citizenship. This wasn't subtle, it was racial exclusion written into federal law for the first time. And yet Asian immigration never fully stopped. People came through loopholes. Students, merchants, diplomats, family members. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake destroyed birth records, Chinese immigrants created paper sons, identities to claim family ties. At Angel Island, immigrants were interrogated for weeks or months to prove their legitimacy. Entire families lived in legal limbo. So here's the first myth oversimplification creates, that Asian Americans weren't here until the bans were lifted. This is false. We were here, but erased. Now let's talk about 1965, because this is where people flatten history into a single soundbite. Yes, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 abolished racist national origin quotas, but it didn't just open the doors to whoever. It created a preference system that prioritized professional skills and family reunification. That matters because after decades of exclusion, the U.S. disproportionately selected highly educated, highly skilled immigrants, doctors, engineers, scientists, many of whom already held elite status in their home countries. This is what scholars call hyperselectivity. That's how the model minority myth was born, not because Asian Americans are inherently successful, but because the U.S. filtered who was allowed to enter. At the same time, because large-scale Asian immigration resumed after such a long gap, many Americans perceived Asian Americans as a new population, ignoring the generations who had already been here, fought legal battles, built communities, and survived exclusion. So now you get two stereotypes operating at once, the model minority myth and the perpetual foreigner. And oversimplified history treats those stereotypes as natural instead of engineered. This is why people think Asian Americans came because of the civil rights movement, without understanding the Cold War context, the propaganda value of showcasing successful non-white immigrants, or the way immigration laws shape demographics by design. I'm not saying it wasn't in a way influenced by the civil rights movement, but it's flattening it, and that flattening has consequences. According to a 2023 Pew Research study, 78% of Asian Americans report experiencing at least one incident where they were treated as a foreigner. 68% say people mispronounced their names. 39% say people assumed they didn't speak English. 32% were told to go back to their home country. 22% were criticized for speaking a non-English language in public. And none of these experiences happen in a vacuum. Asian Americans have been scapegoated repeatedly throughout U.S. history, oftentimes in sickness war and when there's a loss of jobs. Chinese immigrants were blamed for economic decline in the 1800s. Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II, 2/3 of them were U.S.-born citizens. Vincent Chin was unalived in 1982 because people blamed the Japanese for the auto industry decline. South Asians were targeted after 9/11. Asian Americans were attacked during COVID after political leaders labeled it the China virus. And here's another thing people get wrong when they oversimplify. Asian Americans weren't excluded from American civic life. We were drafted into the Vietnam War. In every war, actually. They served, fought, and died for the U.S., often while being seen as the enemy by their own fellow soldiers. Many later became leaders in the anti-war movement. And Asian Americans have always been part of this country, politically, economically, militarily, even when the country refused to fully claim them. Oversimplification hides all of this. It turns a deeply structural problem into a surface-level misunderstanding. It makes people think stereotypes are about culture instead of policy. It prevents people from understanding how oppression actually works, which is quietly, legally, and cumulatively. That's the danger. Because when you don't understand systems, you blame individuals. When you don't understand history, you repeat its narratives. And when you flatten complexity, you make injustice easy to ignore. Asian Americans are not perpetual foreigners. That idea was manufactured, reinforced, and normalized. And the only way to dismantle it is to stop treating history like a headline and start treating it like a system. Because everything causes a reaction that continues on. And ignoring that is exactly how oppression keeps reproducing itself. And I want to reiterate, it is not just history, it is everything. People oversimplify absolutely everything without fully understanding it. I implore you all to be more curious about the specifics and the details, and the why and the how, not just parrot things you hear. There's way too much parroting happening, and it has absolutely contributed to the state that the U.S. is currently in. Let's leave that behind in 2025, shall we? Until next time, y'all.